Hello.
Hello, it's Thomas Hedner. Hi.
So, Kalev, you are live. Please, can you start the introduction? I will have to leave.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yeah, and can you hear me, Thomas?
Yes. Perfect.
Okay, very good then.
So
Fine.
it's my pleasure to have Thomas Hedner here on our webinar with topic of how to generate valuable business ideas in medicine and biotechnology. And I'm really waiting for this webinar to Thomas Hedner to share his experiences with startups, medical entrepreneurship, education, and different ways and experiences with generating and testing and getting the ideas from idea phase to real market products. So thank you for being here, everybody, and I give now the word to Thomas.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see my screen clearly?
Yes.
All right, very good then. Well, it's a pleasure to be on the webinar. It's actually the first time I'm doing this type of seminar series in the cyberspace, but it's really interesting. My background is actually in medicine, so I've been in clinical medicine for decades, and then I've been also a professor in clinical pharmacology, which is related to pharmaceuticals, of course. So I've seen a lot of patients. I've done a lot of research also in the laboratory. And then I'm also a Ph.D. in economics. So I did a second Ph.D. relating to the change in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think that's a really interesting area since it's really changing a lot right now. So what we're seeing is more of a Schumpeterian change of the pharmaceutical industry. So we see from being bigger and bigger and bigger pharmaceutical companies, you know, some of the major ones in the world, which had some 50, 60,000 employees, they are now splitting up in smaller units, and some of them are also been downsized significantly over the last 20 years or so, and that process has been escalating during the last 10 years. So it's some 300, 400,000 people who have been changing their jobs from big pharma to smaller industry, and that is a little bit about what I'm going to talk about. What's really happening, and what will that mean to you, especially if you're interested in creating products and innovations in the life sciences. I think it will be a very interesting area for the future, and I see that clustering and open platforms and so forth will gain a lot of gain for the future. So what we are going to talk about today is a little bit of a strategy, and for me, every project that I've been involved in is different from the previous, and it's really interesting to try to apply some of the learnings that one has made over the decades, and then apply it to real cases. And I've been involved in some of those cases, and I will end up my webinar by telling you about one of those projects that we are involved in. So first of all, as you see in this slide, of course, there is an evaluation phase that is there for all kinds of projects that you would like to pursue. It goes actually from ideation, you know, when you get an idea, and that can come from almost any place. Latter ideas, talking to your friends, suddenly scouting a chance or whatever. And if that goes well, then you have to have a strategy how to bring that idea into something useful, and to create your companies, and to manage your IP, your business strategy, your project or product development, etc., etc. And then, depending on where you are going, you will have to create something for stakeholders out there. And of course, you need to be able to sell your projects if you are going for a trade exit. I've mostly been doing that. Or you have to build a company over the years that should be profitable, of course. So let's look a little bit on the life science arena. And we have had in Sweden a lot of discussions on life science companies and startup, and especially since we've had two big companies, Pharmacia, that was merged with Upjohn some 10-15 years ago, and also AstraZeneca, where things are ongoing at the present moment, where we have had the closure of some plants in Uppsala region and also in the Lund region. We have a big plant here in Göteborg, where there's a lot of scientists and competence, and of course we are curious to see what will happen to that in the future. So for us, we've seen that let's see, yeah, we've seen that the productivity has changed. And if we look at the global pharmaceutical industries, which is illustrated in this slide, you will see that the R&D productivity, that's the number of new drugs per $1 billion spent. If you look at your left-hand side, you see a log scale, and then there is a downward trend up to the early 2000s. And you can see that some 60 years ago, we could spend some $1 billion and we got 20 or 30 new drugs for that. But today, the conditions are completely different. The road and the cost for a new drug, radically new drug, is over $1 billion and it's increasing. And that is, of course, a problem, because if you are working with that, as the big pharma industry has been working with over the years, then you can only spend your time and spend your effort and spend your money on creating drugs for some of the biggest indications in terms of population and money globally. But that is perhaps not at all where the medical need is. Sometimes we see, and often we see, a need in a lot of different arenas, and the big pharmaceutical industries have not been able to deal with that, since their costs for developing new drugs have been really too high. And another interesting thing that you can see from this slide is that that decline, that exponential decline in R&D productivity, has come during an era where we have made major research discoveries, and those research discoveries has not really been translated into innovations to the extent that we would like to have seen. So we have a problem, and it's also illustrated in this slide, also from the 1950s and onwards. You can see that the number of new medicinal entities, NMEs, registered since 1950 is a bit well over 1,000, and I think that's a fantastic result. Most of them are small molecules, and during the last 30 years or so, we've seen an increasing number of biopharmaceuticals. And also, if you can see from this slide, is that we had a peak in the U.S. When it comes to registered drugs in 1997, and then there was a downward decline. And that may have several explanations. One of them is, of course, that at that time the FDA made specific efforts in order to bring some of the molecules that were in their registration sort of pipeline to a close, and that gave us a number of drugs. And then there was a decline. But the troubling thing is that the decline seems to have been going on. And there is probably a fundamental decline going on. And I think that has really spurred the change, ongoing change, the mergers, acquisitions, the layoffs and so forth during the last 10 years. So if you're a big pharmaceutical industry, then you, at least the top 10, they've been producing perhaps 1.5 to 2.5, 2 to 3 new drugs per year with an average peak sales of more than $250 million. But in order to keep their size in terms of their staff and their costs, that is not enough. In order to meet the growth expectations out there, that figure has actually to be up to 9 to 10 drugs if you aim for average peak sales of about $500 million, or 5 to 6 product launches if you are aiming for bigger peak sales. At least one of them over 1 billion, and then 4 to 5 over 750 million in peak sales. So that are the so-called blockbuster drugs, and that is not what you see today. And so the decline of the number of employees is actually related to the fact that the big pharma industry cannot meet those expectations actually from the market and stakeholders and patients and all of us out there. So the change is ongoing. We have had a lot of discussions on this in Sweden because we have had and still have a large pharmaceutical and life science industry. And we've had a number of big companies, some mid-size and some small, and some micro companies. And the micro companies are in this slide depicted as the light shaded green, and the number of companies is on the y-axis to your left. So we have some 600-700 companies at the present moment, and what we see is that the smaller companies are increasing actually, and of course that's good news. And for in terms of employment, I think that's really good. And we have some experiences from the setting when Pharmacia was sold to Upjohn. I actually left Sweden in terms of the Pharmacia company some 10-15 years ago, and then that plant or those operations were mainly in Uppsala, close to Stockholm. And what we saw there was that there was about 2,500 employees in Pharmacia, and now today, 10 years after, we have 3,500. That's an increase in number of employments. And the interesting thing is that those employees are in about 100 companies, from mid-size to micro companies. And as a base for a sustainable employment and a sustainable life science cluster, I think that that scenario is more interesting. Of course, we are all waiting to see what will happen after AstraZeneca, after they closed their operations in Södertälje, south of Stockholm, and also in Lund, in the southern part of Sweden. And what we see is that so far, after a couple of years, that there are a number of companies formed. Most of them, however, in service industries around pharma. Actually, very few of them are in the arena of actually bringing the molecules forward. That's more for medicinal chemistry and pharmacology. And most of them, as I said, in the service arena. So what we see is when the big pharma is leaving and closing down, a lot of new companies rise in the cluster, and I think that's a very interesting phenomenon. But you have to be prepared for that, and that is also partly an active process to really support those small and growing micro companies in order to hopefully see some of them growing to big or even very large companies in the future or the distant future. So that brings us a little bit to innovation, the big pharma industry has mostly been in radical new product innovations. And of course, some of them, like the AstraZeneca here in Sweden, have also been very good in incremental product development in terms of life cycle management. That's very typical for radically new innovations within the life science area. We see that they are usually launched for one indication in the beginning, and then the people out there, competent physicians, researchers, etc., they find additional uses. That's what you call crowdsourcing, or it's sort of a form of open innovation. And then it's important for the company or the manufacturer to really take advantage of that. For example, the beta blockers, beta-adrenergic blockers, which were discovered by ICI and also the Astra Hessle at that time, in the 1970s, they were initially indicated for ischemic heart disease or angina pectoris. But when it came to the market, there was a doctor or a couple of doctors who discovered that it actually lowered blood pressure, and it became one of the largest or most used antihypertensive drugs. Then somebody discovered out there that it actually had an effect on migraines, with a migraine preventive effect. So it became a migraine drug, and new patents were issued, and new products were launched, a new indication. So the life cycle and the use was expanded over the years. We saw that a number of indications appearing. Also congestive heart failure, which was actually a contraindication in the beginning. But somebody discovered that some forms of congestive heart failure actually benefited from being treated with beta blockers, and it became one of the major congestive heart failure drugs over the years. So we see that innovations are jumping. New indications come up, and it's really important to take advantage of that. And that's very common actually in the pharmaceutical industry. I can give you a lot of examples of that, and anything from Viagra, which was actually initially a cardiovascular drug. We have gastrointestinal drugs like Dermatology, which is actually for head lice today, etc., etc. I can give you very, very many examples of that. So I think it's really important to see the incremental product development in addition to the radical. And for me, I think the importance of bringing a radical innovation to the market is that it may also pave the way for additional incremental innovations, and that is what we regularly see. Then going on into the innovation process, of course, we have new processes when it comes to manufacture, etc., etc. And when we looked at, for example, metoprolol, Sahlgrenska, the AstraZeneca cardiovascular drug, which I've just alluded to, we saw that it was covered by a handful or even more patents. And one of those patents actually extended all the way to 2 years ago. And that was a patent relating to a slow-release formulation. And that was just cash flow, almost no cost. So I think that the incremental or process innovations also become really, really interesting to look at. You have other types of innovations, introducing new organizational arrangements when it comes to the knowledge system, management structures, etc., etc. And also when it comes to the market side, of course, there you can have design, packaging, market segment, internationalization, etc., etc. And for example, just an example of design and packaging, the delivery of asthma drugs, the beta agonists and the steroids, they have been benefiting a lot from appropriate inhalators, and there the design, of course, and packaging became really, really important for the end user or the patient. So I think that innovations is a lot more than a new radical innovation, and I think that is really important for the pharmaceutical industry, big or small, to capitalize on the long tail of the innovation. you go to rapid growth firms in general, and especially alluding to the setting that we have in Sweden right now, where we see that we are leaving a little bit of the big pharma strategy and scenario, and going to multiple small and mid-sized firms. And I think it's really important to see which firms do we have, should we support, and what will happen, and what can we expect in the job market for people in the life science industry for the future. Well, if we look at firms in general, we see that most surviving new firms, that may be 50%, you know, in the site in general. If you go to the university clusters, then we usually see a higher survival rate. We see here in the cluster close to Göteborg University that is up to 70 to 80%. But many of those small firms will never grow to become more than some 20 employees or lower. But they are really important since they are job creators, and I will come to that in a minute. A number of them will be gazelles, and it's so less than 5%. And it's very difficult to see which are going to become the gazelles, because it's dependent on a lot of things. For example, entrepreneurship, continuous innovations, accumulation of specific capabilities within the firm, and all of those things. And today I think they will be even more related to innovative activities occurring in open platforms. And openness is not closed or open in that scenario either or, but it can be more or less a lot of business models in between open and closed. There are a number of those out there today. Also, we see that the phases of growth is unevenly distributed over the years. Typically in the life science arena, pharmaceutical industry, rapid growth when there are new product launches, and then it may be slowing down over the years when products are going off patent. We see some new firms, entrepreneur ones, others existing, that is involved in some kind of strategic renewal of some sort that will be growing very, very rapidly. Some grow in expanding markets, others use their capabilities in order to gain market shares out there. But many of the rapid growth fields are still in the very traditional industries, focusing initially on cash flow, then innovation, and then additional cash flows and so forth. And also they are more evenly distributed than the new industries, which are appearing here and there, often in the clusters around the universities today. So I think it's important for policymakers to focus on some of these facts. And importantly also, if we are talking about job creation, we see that 4 out of 5 jobs, 80% of the new jobs created, are in SMEs, and I think that's exactly the same type of scenario you have in Estonia and will have in Estonia in the future. So we see more and more political interest directed towards the small and medium-sized enterprises. One drawback, however, is that in order to gain export capabilities and capacity, sometimes you have to be large. So, for example, in Sweden, we see that we've had a net export of some 15 billion from AstraZeneca, and then additional from other larger players here in Sweden. And when the downsizing occurs, some of that export capabilities is decreasing because there is a very long time from innovation to peak sales. Mostly, it could be 20 years or even more. Some of the cases where we look at today when it comes to innovations, radical innovations, then the path from an idea, initial idea, onto product launch may be even up to 30 years. So I think we have to have, this is a slowly evolving industry, and also it's an industry where the downsizing also appears a little bit slower. But today, as I said previously, we see a lot of change out there in the big pharmaceutical industry, whether they are in US or Europe or any other part. So here in Europe, we see a growth rate of about, for the pharmaceutical industry in general, about 1 to 2%, in the US 3 to 5%, and if you look at China, it's up to 15 to 25%. So a lot of the expansion, I think, in the future will be in the East. And I think that's an interesting thing, and that's also an area of the world where a lot of the pharmaceutical industries are focusing on at the present moment. So so if you are an innovator, you have a lot of challenges, and of course you have to innovate and evaluate. And one question, of course, is how can you possibly compete if you're a small scale actor with 30, 40, or 50,000 people out there? Well, there are niches that you can address, and the closed innovation model structure in the pharmaceutical industry, or big pharma, has been very, very structured. And here is one example, or one slide. You can depict it in many ways, but it's gone from substance development on the left side and identifying new molecules and proteins or whatever, and then early R&D, and then of course there's been the process development, optimization, and so forth, and at the same time the pharmacological modeling has been ongoing, and toxicology studies, of course. And the attrition rate, the number of compounds surviving, is usually very low, maybe 1 or 2 compounds out of some 10,000 to start off in the very early medicinal chemistry screening phase. And that has been the traditional model out there. And of course it has taken not only a decade, but sometimes 12 to 14 years from the start of operations, early operations and research, to registration, if you are lucky. And even at the end of that process, the risk of failure is still very, very high. It's different, it's mostly related to unexpected side effects, and we've seen that multiple times over the last decades, that some very promising medications didn't make it due to the fact that there were a number of unexpected side effects arising. So the question is, can you do it in any other way? Well, what we see is actually a change happening. And this is more like an open model, and it's looks a little bit chaotic, but there is no single linear way through an innovation. And if you actually go back and look at some of the major products that were brought forward, for example, here in Sweden we had omeprazole, the anti-ulcer drug, which became the largest selling drug in the world for some 10 years ago. It was developed here by AstraZeneca. But if you look at the process, there was an idea about the drug, and there was a new protein that was related to proton ion transport that was discovered in the gastric mucosa, and some researchers wanted to exploit that because they had this idea that you could block acid secretion. Well, a couple of molecules were found, and some of them also had effects on the thyroid gland and also other processing. It was very close to being closed down. And then they found a molecule in Hungary, and they went there and actually bought all the rights to that molecule, which proved to be an early version of omeprazole, the proton secretion inhibitors. And from there it was developed gradually. But if you look on the process over the years, that project were nearly being closed down multiple times. Some people say 4 times, others say 5 times. And due to skunk work, more or less, some researchers, they were determined to solve things. They found a way out of that. So the process of innovation is not linear. It goes back and forward. And also a number of indications were developed initially. Zollinger-Ellison, which was a very, very difficult overproduction of hypochloric acid from the gastrointestinal mucosa, which was there in only a few patients. That was the initial validation, actual clinical validation. And from there, a lot of different indications were developed also for omeprazole. So it went a little bit back and forth. And here you can see that, we have a pre-competitive stage on the left-hand side, where actually a lot of research is done in the open arena or the university arena. That is actually where, where 99% of all the life science scientists are. They are outside the pharmaceutical industry. And then it was taken into the competitive industrial platforms where it was more process-oriented in terms of formulation, process management, optimization, and so forth. Product R&D, pre-formulation, and all what's in there in terms of stability studies and testing and release and so forth. And then you had all the clinical and preclinical modeling that was made over the years. And together that ended up in a application for market licensing and approval. And then new things were discovered out there in the post-competitive or the right-hand side arena where it was out there on the marketplace and in the clinic. And then if new things were discovered, then it has to go back again into the competitive platform. So it actually goes back and forth. So what we have is an innovation perspective. What do actually patients and stakeholders need there? What's viable in the marketplace in your lower right-hand side? What's desirable to users out there? The pharmaceutical industry has a lot of stakeholders. Some benefit from taking medication, others are paying different systems in different countries. And you have to take that into account when you are working with registrations in different marketplaces. And of course, what's possible with technology. And what's possible with technology is a top-down type of innovation strategy. What's desirable for users is a bottom-up. And for me personally, I'm more interested and I favor more the bottom-up perspectives, because medicine is not a very stagnant discipline or it's cut in rock, but it's changing all the time. Not, for example, in the cancer arena and the leukemias and other types of hematological cancer. We see a lot of different indications, a lot of different types coming in, especially in the genomic times that we are in the present moment. So new things come up, and we have to address those sort of new diseases with new thinking. So if you have a perspective of what's viable and what's actually needed out there by the patients and for the patient, then I think you have a very interesting perspective. And I think that also brings us to the open arena. So how do you detect an opportunity? Well, for example, if you have an open mind, you see that a lot of those opportunities, they are recognized by serendipity. And one of my researchers is actually working with that in a project relating to immunomodulators, which are actually now being in the very last part of the registration phase. They were out there for discovery some 20, 30 years ago, and a lot of those, when we look at those examples, we see that sometimes it's erratic changes, erratic contacts and meetings that change the path of those innovations. And the simple thing is that the more people you have out there, the more innovative you can be. And that is actually the basis for those open innovation platforms. So you may have, between closed and open, there may be open contest, and there's a number of like incentives and so forth. You have pre-competitive platforms for research tools, the IMI, BioBricks and so forth. You have open communities where users actually set the agenda, like patients like me and so forth. What are the needs out there? You have expert networks and so forth that are included in the open type of innovation organizations. And they're really expanding a lot these days. So I think we are going from a closed perspective, which you can see on your left-hand side, to a network or a business ecosystem. So it's from supply chain management, management organization to innovation, entrepreneurship, business type of ecosystem. Top down to bottom up, and I think that's the right way to go for the future. And I think that if we can build with this in a structured way, I think we can create jobs, and I think we can also create the innovations in the product out there that the patients will ultimately need in the life science arena, whether it's pharmaceuticals alone or a combination of medical devices and pharmaceuticals and all of that. So the new novel innovation structures, it actually builds on a simple concept. And that concept is that the majority of all creative researchers, innovators, and entrepreneurs, they're actually outside big pharma. And instead of being a team of some 10 to 30 people inside a company, which may partly be path dependent, you can be 1,000 people out there which are thinking in all types of ways with all kinds of backgrounds and a high degree of competence, of course. But you have to organize them, and there are a number of organizational platforms, and together with Tobias Thomblad, a colleague of mine, we went through the organizational platforms, and that was part of my research work in economics some years ago. And I also think that big pharma sees opportunities, and they are today involved in a number of platforms. But I think it's one thing to develop from bottom up, from de novo, and create those open communities. And another thing is to go from a closed to a more open community. I think that the second thing is more difficult, because if people have been in the closed platforms, they are usually used to that. And when I meet people here, I see a big difference in their attitude and their thinking, depending on from where they come. And there's, as I said, a lot of different platforms. And about 2 years ago, when we surveyed, there was about 50 different platforms. I think that's much more today. And there are a number of them which are really interesting. Some of my favorites are relating to third world medicine. For example, TB Alliance for tuberculosis. We have medicine for malaria ventures, MMB. We have drugs for neglected diseases, DNDi. And they have been for TB medicines, malaria, where we have seen no innovations for some 30, 40 years. But the last 10 years, when we have had these open public-private partnership type of platforms, then we've seen an explosion of innovations. So I think in those settings, we see that the open platforms are operational. They are bringing molecules to medicines. We see that registrations are coming out of that. And we are researching those at the present moment. I think they are really, really exciting. So I think that that arena, neglected arena for the third world medicine, I'm not surprised to see that the open platforms are operational initially there. I think they will move, that concept will move from third world medicine into first world medicine over the next decade to come. That's my guess. So if you have open innovation processes, and here is a little bit part in Swedish, but I think you can read that, you can see that there are communities, there are partnerships, there are user-driven innovation, crowdsourcing out there. You see that there are open platforms, immediate market, spin-in, spin-outs, so forth, open standards, patent auctions, you have the wisdom of crowds and crowdsourcing and so forth. So there's a number of things that are discussed and a number of concepts used in some of these open platforms. But it's not open and closed again, it is everything in between. So I think we'll see a lot of sort of organizational model innovations over the years to come, and it will be very interesting to see which of them are surviving in their specific settings and so forth. So if you are into developing your own company and you're in life science, of course, there are a number of challenges, not only when it comes to innovations as we just discussed, but also when it comes to evaluation and strategies. And in the companies that I've been involved in, and I will show you some in the last part of my speech, I think we start out with exit planning. What do we want to achieve? And that's really important, so we can sort of streamline people and get the mindset where we actually are going. And we usually deal with these things in a very structured manner. So we have, of course, people with different types of knowledge. They are more or less in open platforms. We have one project manager, and then we develop the projects out of there for as low cost as possible. It's really developing things on a shoestring. And what we do is that we write an agreement for common exit. So we have been working with trade sales and not with generating companies which will be selling drugs actually in the marketplace. Others are much better at that. We think that we are better in the innovation and development phases. So I think it's very important, what do you want to achieve and how do you want to do that? Because that impacts on the people you need and people you must gather in order to bring your idea into something useful, into a project. And for example, I want to risk reduce because I haven't access to 20 or 30,000 people, but we have good project leaders, and I have a big network of people who are working in various areas of the life science sector. For example, early researchers, medicinal chemists, people in the with pharmaceutical knowledge, people who know galenics and pharmaceutical technology, preclinical science, clinical science and clinical experts, lawyers and legal people who have expert knowledge into how to structure the exits. How do you actually do that? And how do you find your buyer and how do you plan for that? And that has to be done very early. And of course, intellectual property, very, very important, because some of the, or most of the projects, or almost all of them, we have started out with ideas where we didn't know whether or not we would have an intellectual property platform. So that's one of the first things we do. So I'd like to work with chronic treatment for clinical diseases. And the simple reason for that is that chronic treatments generate cash flows. So then you can be competitive out there. If you have worked for example, with some of the antibiotics, some people maybe use it once or twice during their lifetime, and of course that's a difficult area for a small company to be, and also for some of the large companies. And actually today we see that antibiotics is not really one of the major areas for innovation, but we would certainly need more of those. So that is one of the first things that I look at, chronic diseases and cash flows. We almost always use with known compounds or even endogenous substances. And the reason for that is that we bring down the risks. I mean, if you have an endogenous compound which comes out of your own body, then the risk of side effects, unless you dose it excessively, and with that risk of side effects, of course, is low. And you will be much less inclined to see very sudden or unusual side effects there. Very important is that intellectual property should be possible. And since we are not working with radically new agents, then some substance patents are difficult to achieve. But you can have indication patents, and you can have formulation patents and so forth. You can build a patent portfolio around that. And that is actually what we have achieved in a couple of cases where we built some 3, 4, 5 patents around our innovation. But that comes gradually, and it's more like a bottom-up process. Also important is that you have to, if you're working with known compounds, then galenics becomes really important. We are working a lot with repurposing, reformulation, new purposes, new indications, new doses, new formulations, and so forth. So we may have, for one substance that's in tablet formulation that we want to give in a sublingual or some other type of, or a nasal spray or something like that. Then, of course, it will not be possible to use the tablets for the new indications. And, of course, it may give you an upper hand on your competitors, and you can go for an innovation and also assume those costs and negative cash flows over a number of years. That's necessary to develop the innovation. We also are very interested to work with indications, clinical indications, where the prevalence or disease prevalence or the incidence of new cases is pretty high. And of course, again, it creates cash flows for the company that hopefully eventually is going to buy our innovation. One of the most important things is also that we work with evaluable endpoints. That should be clinically relevant, they should be economically possible, feasible, often symptomatic, and the important thing for us is that you get relevant data immediately, more or less. So if we look for a painkiller, of course, you see an effect hopefully within hours or at least days. If you work with an Alzheimer drug, and especially with prevention, you may have to wait for decades before you will see effects, and that is impossible for a small company. So very important, that endpoint has to be possible to evaluate within a short-term perspective. We also often work with an orphan drug track, and that is something that becomes evident with years. And as I said previously, we see that a lot of the diseases can be sort of split up like diabetes. You have a lot of different types in type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes, so forth. So even there, if you have a major indication like diabetes, type 2 diabetes, you may find orphan uses. And we use that as a part of our exit strategy. And also, if you work with the orphan drug strategies, you can also get regulatory assistance by the FDA in the United States or EMA here in Europe, and of course that is really important. We also would like to see a life cycle management type of strategy, or at least that it can be formed, that we can see during the process that there will be new and additional indications or new combinations that could be used and developed. And of course, that would have a positive effect on your exit planning and ultimately the price that you can get for your innovation when you've been driving it forward. So that's, I think, is really important. You have to select your project because you cannot work with everything. You have to be really, really selective and only go for the best. But also important, and I think that's stressed by anybody or everybody who is in the entrepreneurial settings, you have to build your team. And first of all, we go for our teams of people who are more or less all over Northern Europe, and we link people up also who are in different other parts of the world. But sometimes you have to reach them, and so we can have our safety toxicology studies in one area. We have always been buying that. Some of the core competencies for us, for example, like galenics, we must have in our near arena like Northern Europe or in Scandinavian, Baltic or Nordic countries up here, and it's important for us to keep relations with that. But also you have to build your team with not only the different type of knowledge that you will need in the early development discovery phase, and then in the later type of development where you need another type of competence, because then you cannot go back and forth and explore things that you should have done in the beginning. Those things, you know, occur on and off, but you have to be more in the process area. And also importantly, you have to work with people who can work together. Sometimes I've seen people who get upset and you know, they become enemies in the project, and that's of course disastrous. Anybody can understand that. So therefore, a common exit, a common focus, and also people that you know can have some kind of idea that first they give and then they get. I think you should always see it in that order. Then, of course, you have to link up and look at all the data out there. You need a life science intelligence strategy. So when you are coming close to formulating your project out of your initial ideas when you detected your opportunity, you have to get all the data that's out there into your hands. And in order to do that, you have to have a systematic approach. And we are using, I've been working with a small company here in Sweden called Monocle. They're actually been our students in the GIBS master courses to be Estonian, and they are building a very interesting company where they've downloaded actually all information that's out there in PubMed, all the conference abstracts available, and all the other knowledge out there known, so for company home pages, and of course all the databases that they can address. And that's quite a big undertaking, but and then to do something meaningful out of that is even more difficult. But it can be done, and I think it will be important to have that in the future, because we see a problem or a possibility to use big data scouting. And today, enormous amounts of scientific and commercial data is generated. And by 2025, it's not that distant, we will see that the Medline data, PubMed data will double every year or even more than that. So that increases the prior knowledge that you have to be able to go through. And for some innovators who are not do not have the possibility to use these types of systems, I think it will be problematic. So actually, I think in the near future we see too much data out there and too many data sources to be able to handle that by ad hoc or just intuitive methods. We have to have some kind of systematic approach to it, and data mining will be absolutely necessary sooner or later. And then you have to make sense out of those big data constellations, and of course life science intelligence is sort of a name for that, and I think that will be essentially more and more used by innovators and entrepreneurs. We use it all the time after our initial ideation or opportunity recognition period. We put you know, as much as we can get together by manual methods, and then we have to have a systematic approach to look at all the data that could be out there as prior knowledge. We have to have full control of that. We also identify our competitors or potential competitors early on, so, and we need to be able to follow their progress, of course, closer. And of course, if we can try to look into the future, that would be a great thing. And I think there may be some kind of possibility if you have access to a systematic type of data mining or a systematic approach to life science intelligence. And of course, at that stage, you have to build your team, and you probably have been thinking about that previously. And you also have to convince a number of stakeholders out there and align them in respect to your business model. Owners, shareholders, you may have friends and colleagues and so forth, and experts that you want to align. You have to build a management. We do that pretty simple. We have one project leader in project companies, and then we have a major holding company which is part owner, and then we have private owners of our companies, of course. But that management has to be functional. And all our business angels, which have specific competence within the life science arena, they work more or less for free in respective setting, that they can invest money and become business angels, and of course also capitalize if we come to a conclusive exit or sale. Financiers, business angels, I like to work with business angels, people who are on top of their own money, rather than venture capitalists who are trying to handle other people's money, because business angels, they are much more quick to respond, and they also think differently in terms of risks and opportunities. Of course, you may have employees, you may have patients, society, etc., etc. So there's a number of stakeholders that you have to be thinking of, and some of them you have to involve. Sometimes we do a stakeholder analysis, and of course, I guess you know a lot about that. And I think it's interesting from the setting that sometimes you come up with stakeholders which you haven't really thought about, which may be really important for your company and the way that you manage it. And for example, it may be stakeholders with a low interest, with a high power, and of course them you have to have on your side. And if they have a high interest and low power, or even high power, you quite often they are optimistic and interested in what you are doing. So you can deal with that in a number of ways, but you have at some stage really come to grips with who your stakeholders are. And then you have to align all things and all powers and so in your favor when it comes to life science, intelligence, opportunities, people, intellectual property, and so forth, financing, process development, market competitive info, your exit strategies, and all that, and all your internal agreements. But that's all of the functioning of developing small companies, as I guess you know a lot about. And then, of course, I think it's really important for yourself as an innovator entrepreneur, what your category may be, that you come to grips on what you are good at yourself. And for me, it took almost 50 years before I understood that I was more of an innovator type than a process type people. And then I often align myself with people who are in the process, because then I can deal with things that I believe I'm a bit competent in. So, for example, are you early stage or late phase? Early stage innovation entrepreneurship, or later phase organization management type of person. I think you have to stick to what you are good at, and then find others, and that would be the best to do the other things. And they should also be your friends and remain your friends when you are dealing with your company. And also, you know, the way that you like to work. Are you a person who deals with one single project and you want to focus on that, or are you a person who are an innovative type and you want to find people to work with a number of your potential innovators, and then you have to manage that differently, and you have to build your future, of course, around that. So either you may have a resource accumulation strategy, portfolio management, depending on what kind of business opportunity or opportunities you are actually involved with. Right, and then you have to come to the later part, you know, strategy execution, and even there, or most often, you will encounter a lot of difficulties, a lot of delays, a lot of problems, but also a number of opportunities. And I think that's important. And I think if you look at entrepreneurs, they are often very resilient. You know, they can be optimistic, but many of the very good entrepreneurs that I know, they never give up. You know, they may be a bit bit depressed sometimes, but they always come back with a new twist and a new angle to solve things. And I think that's really important. Also, you may find intellectual property opportunities coming up. And I think this is really important because sometimes you may have a patent out there which you saw in the beginning, and then when you come a little bit further in your project development, you see that, well, it's actually two major indications that you are addressing, and it may be a little bit different innovations. One of the indication may use one type of galenic formulation or type, it may be a tablet, while the other you need a spray, for example. And it may be so that you have different exit strategies for those two ideas. And then you are into the intellectual property disassembly problem. If you have to have cross licenses, that creates a problem. So the earlier you can see the development of your projects, whether or not you are in one single project and you will remain in one single project, or if you actually have different opportunities evolving. I think that's really important. But of course, it's really important to have a focused strategy. So if you see other opportunities, you may have to delay them, or you may have to set another team on the track to work with that. But of course, it may split your resource accumulation focus and so forth. So there is benefits and there are problems, you know, always coming up, and you have to solve them in a wise way. We often escalate our transaction support and our efforts to find an exit partner at this stage, and we structure that very clearly, so we know exactly what, or hopefully we not exactly, but a lot about what type of projects or companies out there would have an interest of our specific company or project, who can be our potential customers. And I say customers too. We never go for an exit unless we have two bidders, and they have to remain bidders on, you know, the very late stages of the exit process. Because if you only have one, you are you may be in a problem. So there's a lot of things that you have to think about when it comes to the last part of your project. And of course, if you have signed a deal for or a paper for a common exit, of course that simplifies things a lot. People don't you know, come up with different agendas and think differently in that stage of the project. You can't do that. You have to have a unified attitude and focus. Right. So even at the exit stage, there is a lot of data that you have to accumulate, and we are at that stage also looking through our patent portfolio. We are seeing, are there any weaknesses and so forth? Could there be any patent litigations and so forth? And we try to cover everything up at that stage. So we are really sure of what we have and what we do not have and what we need to improve, what will actually meet us out there during the sales and exit process, during our trade exit. So again, you have to have a life science strategy in order to be able to find that out. And I think that can make major differences in the price that you may get for your project if you're going for that. So here is, for example, again, Monocle. There's a number of other companies, but I would say that this is one of the best out there. Also, we know that we need the entrepreneurs, not only the innovators, and here you have a number of entrepreneurial traits, and those are the type of people that we would like to gather in our project. And also, you know, even if we are in the end or the latter part in your project development before an exit, you quite often need additional people. You would need the people who can negotiate or have experience of negotiating with big pharma, for example, and that they have access also to the top boardrooms. And we often use special consultants, and sometimes you can find them out there in banks and other organizations. And so it's sort of a personal skills, entrepreneurial traits that come in also at this particular late stage. So social intelligence, emotional intelligence, very important, and I think that you need empathy, clarity of thoughts, compassion, and so forth, strength of character, rather than a focus on money and euros at that particular stage. And also, when it comes to your working team, you have to have very high standards, because there is always a discussion on value division, who is doing what and how and so forth, and that really needs a lot of disciplines, and you have to be able to face facts even if they are negative sometimes. So teamwork, meritocracy and so forth, fair treatment, I think is really important, and for some people like me, I work with a number of different projects because I think that is really important. And if you are going to work with several projects, of course, you cannot be enemies with the people that you are having in your project, but they should be and remain, of course, your friends all the time. So trust and sharing becomes important, as I have said several times, especially when you work with your friends. You have to know what you are good at, as we've always seen in the initial part of the discovery early on. Are you an innovator, opportunity recognizer, or are you a process person who can be really focused and really dedicated until you have made your trade sales? And even after that, you see that you may have, for example, 25–30% in a down payment, and then the rest are milestones which you have to achieve. So working with those milestones, when you've actually sold your products, you have to reach the milestones, and there it becomes really important that you have good people and that you remain close colleagues and you have a working relationship with everybody also after you have formally signed the agreement and you're working to meet the milestones, because that may take several years after you have made your initial transaction. So, as a financier and a business analyst, I think there are a number of people. I work, as I indicated previously to you, mostly with business analysts, because they have often a competence within their arena. They've been working with innovation projects before. Many of them, some of them, they've made a little bit of money in their innovation projects. And what a lot of people do is that they go and put their money in other projects which I like, and so they're dealing with their own finances and money. That is not the case with venture capitalists who deals with other people's money, and they are often more nervous in their decisions, and so I think it's more difficult to work with people who have a money focus only and not a project focus or a deep knowledge in the area that you are working with. But there are different ways to go forward. Some of the thoughts that I've listed up here, I think, could be worthwhile thinking about. And resources, wealth, accumulation takes time, often much longer than you initially believe. And that's one of my reasons why I work with a group of people that I've been working with, that I know have the competence, and also, of course, if you have a strategy to work with several projects, you can always capitalize on one or two or several of them, and you never know which ones, because there are always risks and opportunities, and things may go wrong and they may go very right. So therefore you can you can even that out over the years. I think it's really important also to be quite selective, that you have an agenda, and you saw my agenda previously, what type of projects I'm working with. And you should only go for the best ones, because you know, a month ahead or 2 months ahead, you may come up with an even more interesting project. And there are a number of attractive opportunities out there, and you have to be selective there, because you get path dependent. Once you have started to invest, whether it's time and knowledge or money in one project, you often feel that you need to follow through. So therefore, you should only start with the good projects, since a lot of projects will be difficult to terminate or leave, and even if you do, it may be quite costly for you. And but many times you may be forced to reevaluate things, and then I think you have to do that in a very rational way, which is quite difficult sometimes, because there are new risks coming up. For example, when it comes to competitors, you know, project management, you know, may become chaotic, or problems may arise, or whatever, and sometimes you need to shut down projects. And if you work with a number of projects, of course, shutting one of them down often is not a major problem. So let's go to a little bit about reality and risks and opportunities out there. And I'll tell you about one project that I've been involved in, and it's actually a starting point for me as a more systematic business developer or innovator, and it's within a partnership or business angel partnership called PULS, which you see on your lower left. It's a project for utility investments in life sciences, and there's a Swedish translation of that as well. And on the right-hand side, you see Sahlgrenska Hospital, and I'm working somewhere in the middle of that and sitting there right now. And this project started actually 2002, and it was commercialized 2004. We exited that 2011, and it was a very old molecule. You can see that on the right hand side. And the molecule was identified in 1935, 2 Americans. They ultimately got the Nobel Prize for that in the 1950s. Merck and Company commercialized it, life-saving in many diseases, but there were side effects that limited long-term use. That molecule was cortisol. You all could use it right now. You're sitting looking at this slide, and here you see some of the gentlemen that were involved in the discovery and detection of that molecule in the Mayo Foundation. And it was at the time when, as we see it now, science was a little bit more primitive. But it became a major medication for inflammatory diseases and so forth. And it was also life-saving in people who lack the ability to secrete cortisol. There's a disease called Addison's disease, which was actually discovered in the late 1700s by an English or Scottish physician. So, as I said, we started out 2002, we commercialized it in 2004, and 2011, 2012, we sold the project. And it was called DuoCort. Duo for 2, Cort for cortisone, and incorporated. And because we knew that the secretion of cortisone was not linear, it was not the same all over the 24 hours, but it varied actually. And the disease we were targeting was a serious disease, adrenal insufficiency. And we want, although cortisone may be used for a number of diseases, inflammatory diseases, asthma, allergic disorders, and so forth, they were usually not life-threatening to the same extent as adrenal insufficiency. So those who lack cortisol, they more or less die within 24 hours. And there may be several reasons for that. One of the more common one today is thrombosis. For the suprarenal glands, centuries away it was tuberculosis and so forth. And there are also a number of genetic disorders. So there are a number of primary adrenal insufficiency and Addison's disease is the most important. There are also secondary forms where you have hypothalamic pituitary disorder, where you have some kind of error further up, sort of in the brain. 260,000 people in the Western world, quite a large figure. The treatment was lifelong, continuous, required a daily treatment, and it provided a non-physiological actual replacement in the way that it was given previously with 2 or 3 pills. The major problem was, however, that when cortisone was given exogenously from outside in tablets, cardiovascular mortality increased because some of these people got diabetes, higher susceptibility of diabetes, and the risk of dying from a cardiovascular disease was between 2 to 3 times, 200% and 300% in males and females, respectively, of the normal population. And we thought that that must be due to overdosing of corticoids, because the aim was actually to provide the physiological kind of dose level. And there was also a lot of infections, partly coming from the fact that they got more diabetic complications, and you were triggering diabetes in some instances. You had osteoporosis and a lot of other side effects as well. This is actually the innovation we come up with. You see that on the lower right. It may look very trivial, but it's actually not. We had an immediate release coating, as you can see on your lower left, on the outside in black, and there was an extended release core. So it was a modified release kind of tablets. It was produced by GMP, and we used all the standards that were necessary to go forward. We actually rested on a more conventional drug delivery technology, which we tweaked in our favor. So we got a patent also on the formulation, and it was dependent on or related to these 2 parts, immediate and extended release parts, respectively. So we actually got 3 or 4 patents over the years on a drug or a formulation that was known for more than 60 years. And that was quite interesting, because if you go for some of the modern technologies like drug-eluting stents and so forth, you see that there was an abundance of patents out there, but very little for these old products or projects. And so we got the patent on the release over 24 hours. We got the patent on the formulations. We got the patent on a number of other things that we achieved with our things. So we built a patent portfolio around it, and I think that became very, very important. And here you can see the circulating levels. In the gray shaded area, you can see that it follows a 24-hour diurnal secretion, which is really high in the morning, and it actually starts to shoot up during the night, which you can see in the middle, the gray shaded bar in the middle. So it starts to go up there in the early morning. It comes up really high, and then in the afternoon, evening, it comes down low again. So it's a cyclical secretion, and we thought that that is really important in order to avoid the side effects, because then you let the body rest for part of the night, for example, while it's high during the daytime when you need to cope with all the stresses out there. And in the line with the bars depicted here, you can see our formulation, and it was even higher top peak concentration and even a little bit lower on the night side. And so we started out there and did our proof of principle experiment. And this is actually on a limited number of people. I think it's 4 people. And it's Gudmund Johannesson, the endocrinology professor. It's me. It's 2 other physicians out there. So we actually tested it on ourselves in the beginning, and we saved a lot of time and we saved a lot of money. We asked the regulatory authorities afterwards, and they said, well, it says you are supposed to know what you are doing and know about the risks. It is not illegal, but maybe you should consider other ways to do it the next time. So We even supplied that knowledge to the regulatory authorities. We saved a lot of millions of Swedish crowns in that type of process, and we also saved a number of years going forward because we could test a number of initial type of formulation until we arrived at the one that we thought was most feasible and useful. So what we achieved over those years up to 2011-12 when Solid was a new oral delivery system, which actually simplified the glucocorticoid replacement therapy once a day rather than 2 or 3, and it produced a more physiological exposure to cortisol, which was important because we could make monitoring more robust, dose titration easier, and the pharmacokinetics, of course, became more robust with that. And when we tested our profile in patients, because one of our colleagues, Gudmundur, he had access to most of the patients, not only here in Göteborg, but also in the rest of the country and the Nordic countries, because he had a specific research interest in that. And as you know, we have a teacher's extension. So here in Sweden, so if you're a university researcher or employee or teacher, your innovation belongs to yourself, not the university. So you can negotiate that with that, and a lot of people, they use university-based TTOs, but we have created our own system, PULS, with a much more stringent focus, and also we work with shoestring economy, which I think is really, really important. So also at the lower part of this slide, you see that the DuoCort or the Plenadrem preparation, which was named later on by the company that bought it, it improved metabolic outcome, so blood glucose became lower, blood pressure was lowered, lipids lowered, bone metabolism was improved, and also important quality of life improved. So it was not only related to living longer, but also living shorter. And the interesting thing is that actually we got it registered on the intermediate endpoint that I just mentioned to you, and also, of course, the concentration profiles that we achieved. So we didn't have to demonstrate survival data because that would have made it impossible to go on. So we received a tablet and a new preparation and a new medicine with a more physiological doses. We showed that you could live longer based on the risk factor profile, and we could actually calculate that according to known and established type of risk factor charts, and of course quality of life improved also in our double-blind experiments that we did. And then we actually sold it. So we had started out our exit process years ahead, and we started out with some 100 of companies that we approached, and then we structured that into from information to interest, and then firmer interest, and then into the data room and so forth, and then the bidding process. And at the time when we sold it, we were into that process in November 2011. There was a lot of fuss about the Saab industry, and you can see that in this daily industry. I think you have a similar journal in Estonia. But then up to your right here, you can see that there is this small note on bingo for researchers. That was us. There was no bingo thing. We knew exactly what we were doing. And the value that we captured was bigger than the whole of Saab, actually, to our advantage. So we made that trade sale, and we are still working to fulfill the milestones, and we'll see where we will get, if we will, but hopefully we'll come close to the Saab deal. And we are working with a number of other things. For example, in this PULS, we have a local implant for drugs, which is flutamide for prostate cancer. It's more difficult. It doesn't really fit with the endpoint that I explained to you previously, but we are in the late phases of that project. We have bacterial vaginosis called LaCure, which is oligolactates, where we are actually in the exit phase. We have an acute corticosteroid, AccuCort, We have an AnaMar Pharma, which is in the late stages of clinical development, which is epidemic keratoconjunctivitis, an eye disease where we have come up with a new treatment, which is actually soluble receptors which you can instill in the eye. And it's an eye disease where you may end up with complications, eye complications, if you don't treat it correctly. And then adding on that, we have a number of projects coming in a more of early phase. They are usually not preclinical. We have one which is more related to new to the world type of discoveries in the cancer arena, Lacton, but the other one are in the clinical ones, so we are constantly working with innovations, and we have some 4 or 5 that we hopefully will be able to bring to this platform within the near future. And so that we take it from early clinical phases up to late and the exit stages there. And here is the website if you want to look at that, PULS Invest, which I have been involved with, and we, as far as we understand, we are the leading private life science incubator at the present moment, and we work a lot in concert with universities, and sometimes we take over some of the projects that we've been initially incubated in the university settings, for example. So that was a little bit about my story. It's possible to do things even if you are very few, but then you have to few people. You have to have the network with the right competence, and you have to do things in a different way, and also structure your innovation model, in a very, very different way. And this is just in Swedish to show my philanthropic side. It's about young people with cancer. This is the daughter of one of my colleagues, Bernd Evert, who he was the CEO of, or he was the medical director of MEDA, and which is a very rapidly expanding Swedish pharmaceutical company. Now he is more and more in innovation, so some of them I do together with him. This is his daughter, who suddenly got acute myeloid leukemia. She was taken to hospital and given a 50% chances of surviving, and she did. And she came up, she was treated with a medication that was actually developed in China, and then coming to Europe, and she is now a healthy young woman. And then he set up a foundation to provide support to young people with cancer, either if it's research or people who come up with good ways to inform about this type of disease and types of disease in society. So that's the philanthropic side. So that's actually my story. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and for your in-depth overview of the principles of how you find and select and implement the ideas. As we have run out of time, let's agree with attendees that they can send questions if they have on written form, and we'll figure out the way how to get the answers to them later on. So thank you, Thomas, and thank you for all the attendees for this webinar, visiting this webinar, and I hope that everybody had a very interesting listening. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks a lot. And then we end it here.
Yep.
Yeah, very good. Thanks a lot for listening. Bye-bye then.
Bye.
Bye.